My name is David McLennan. I'm the CEO at the City of Vincent. The City of Vincent, if you don't know, is an inner city local council which captures the inner city suburbs just north of the Perth CBD. The City of Vincent sits alongside the Derbil Yerrigan, which is the Whadjuk Noongar name for the Swan River. The artwork behind me is by Jay Dolman, and it's called Budja Nakalak Yangini. It is based on an old map of the waterways around the City of Vincent. I was born and raised in Wagen, in the wheat belt. Wagen is the Noongar word for the emu's watering place, and it is about halfway between here in Perth and Albany as the crow flies. I've lived, travelled and worked in many places around the world, but this is the place I call home. I really love the hot, dry summer heat and the washed out green of the Australian bush. I like seeing the black cockatoos flying through the pale sky, and I'm grateful to be able to share this land with you, and I pay my respects to Whadjuk elders, past and present, who are its true custodians. So welcome to this NZOG National Regulators Community of Practice webinar. Today we're talking about what is culturally responsive regulation and how do we work with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partners to achieve it. I'm particularly pleased to welcome and acknowledge our speakers joining us today. Jacqueline McGowan, who is the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Western Australia. Welcome, Jacqueline. Richard Weston is the New South Wales Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal Children and Young People. And also welcome to Dr. Josephine Bourne from the University of Queensland. I'll shortly introduce our panelists who will speak for around 8 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and we do welcome your questions. Culturally responsive regulation is a priority on the NRCoP's 3-year plan. We want your ideas as an audience, and you'll also hear from our expert speakers to help inform the program of work we're putting together for NRCoP in this area. So please send through your suggestions as well as your questions throughout the session. Growing up as a kid in a country town in Western Australia, I was aware of the huge disadvantages which faced the Aboriginal kids that I lived next to and went to school with. It was rarely talked about and never explained to me why it was this way. It seemed to me that this disadvantage facing Aboriginal families was either accepted or ignored. And if it was talked about, it was with a general sense of apathy that nothing could be done about it. My first career was as an Australian diplomat, and I loved representing Australia overseas in countries like Papua New Guinea, Mexico, Peru, and the United Kingdom. A key part of that role was promoting Australia's success in areas such as trade, investment, tourism, science, agriculture, energy, sport, obviously, but also human rights. People overseas can clearly see how Australia has succeeded in so many areas, but they cannot understand the inequality and injustice which still faces Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It is clear to me that no matter how well Australia does as a nation in any of those other areas of our society, we'll never succeed as a country until we have lasting reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That is why this topic is so important. We are a national community of regulators at federal, state, and local levels in every type of government regulation, in every type of agency. We can absolutely do something both individually and as organisations we represent to achieve social and economic justice in this country. We all play a role in the national agreement on closing the gap. That is not somebody else's responsibility. It is not the responsibility of a different government agency. We are all responsible. I really commend this great document and explainer that was put together by Shane Hoffman, who is NZOG's First Nations Senior Advisor and it helps explain what the national agreement means for public servants. I wanted to highlight one section in particular of that explainer, and I think Shane's online, he might be able to put the link up to that document. The document explains, under the national agreement, all parties have committed to systemic and structural transformation of mainstream government organisations to improve accountability and respond to the needs of First Nations. And all governments at all levels agree to the following transformational elements: to identify and eliminate racism within all institutions of government, to embed and practice meaningful cultural safety, to deliver services in partnership with First Nations and their organisations and their communities, and to increase accountability through transparent funding allocations, to support First Nations cultures and to improve engagement with First Nations. So significant transformation will be needed across all areas of government, and a lot of areas that our audience and our NRCoP members regulate: the police, courts, youth detention, prisons, hospitals and other health services, education providers, child protection, early childhood, age and disability care, and social services, to name just a few. I think this presents public servants with significant opportunities to review our current working arrangements. Are they consistent with the content and spirit of this national agreement? Can they be improved? And what systemic reform is needed at all levels to embed these transformational elements? Although fundamental change must be driven from the top, it is important that it's not just top down. While they need a strong authorising environment, all public servants, including ourselves, have a role to play in ensuring they have or acquire the knowledge and skills to play their part. Today's webinar is going to help in that regard. I'm particularly pleased to be able that Jacqueline has been able to join us today. Jacqueline is the West Australian Children and Youth Commissioner. I'll introduce Jacqueline by noting she has a long history of working in education, child protection, and Indigenous affairs. Jacqueline was most recently the CEO of Thoroughly, an Aboriginal controlled community organisation, which delivers critical supports and services to families following a loss or suicide or other fatal traumatic incident. Jacqueline's experience includes senior executive roles across the public sector, Commonwealth, Victorian and West Australian governments, private and NGO sectors. She's lived and worked in all Australian jurisdictions, except Tasmania, for those joining us from Tasmania today, and has developed very strong relationships across the community and the non-government and government sectors. Jacqueline is committed to strengthening the systems that improve the opportunities available to all children and young people. Her experience and heritage, her cultural connections to Arrernte and Warramungu country in the Northern Territory has given her a strong focus on the interests and needs of Aboriginal children and young people, as well as those from vulnerable and disadvantaged backgrounds. Jacqueline, welcome, and look forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, David. Firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting in Boorloo, Perth, on Whadjuk Noongar country, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. As David said, I'm an Arrernte Warramungu woman, and so it's really important for me that the elders keep me safe and that I acknowledge that they do that as I walk on their lands every day. So I was asked to talk a bit about the role I have as an advocate in a mainstream role as an Aboriginal woman and what the WA context might be. And so I'm not a regulator. Many of the Australian, New Zealand commissioners and guardians or advocates have regulatory roles. In WA, I don't have a regulatory role. So we have a monitoring role, we have a research role, but we don't actually regulate. So we monitor the health and wellbeing of children aged 0 to 17 years. I'm also, as I said, a mainstream role. So I'm the Commissioner for Children and Young People rather than the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, and we don't have a specific role in WA. Nonetheless, my Act says that I must pay particular attention to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, and those from other disadvantaged groups. I hate that term. I'd rather use vulnerable, but the Act says disadvantaged. So there is no doubt that we must pay special attention to our First Nations kids. We are behind the dial on a whole range of areas, and this is something that the whole community needs to come together to address. In WA, being culturally responsive requires you to understand the differences in the cultural groups. One of the biggest challenges we have in Australia is thinking that we are a homogeneous society of First Nations people. And we think of Australia as a country. For Aboriginal people, Australia is a continent, and we had, close to 400 countries and religions. Our dreaming, whilst there are consistencies, there are differences, and languages. So in order to create a platform for change, to see less of our children in out-of-home care, in incarceration, more of them engaged in education and taking advantage of life opportunities, I have to build strong relationships across government and community and have frank and open conversations. We must be focused on the needs of those we serve, and if we commence with a conflictual relationship, change will not happen. And structural racism is a very real issue. And I hate the term casual racism because there's nothing casual about racism. But the fact that people might say to me, look, I'm not racist, but, well, the minute you say but, I determine that you probably are racist and you just don't realise it. The challenges is that a Western model of governance is the predominant approach to governance and regulation. This undermines a cultural governance and cultural authority approach to how we deliver services on behalf of government. And to be culturally responsive, you must be open to understanding the cultural context. There is a place for both Western and a cultural approach, but they have to be blended together if we're going to be successful about change and if we're going to be able to stop a conflictual relationship that commonly occurs in a regulatory approach. As an example, if you're engaging with community, it is not always reasonable to suggest that the Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, and especially they're often non-Indigenous CEOs, means you're engaging with those who hold cultural authority. To demonstrate that, I think I'll use the Fitzroy Valley as an example. In the Fitzroy Valley some years ago, there was a government and community forum called the Fitzroy Futures Forum. And the Indigenous representatives on the forum, the governing council, were not the CEOs of the ACOs. They were, in fact, two senior representatives, a male and a female, from each of the 5 language groups in the Fitzroy Valley: Ningina, Walmatjari, Wangkatjungka, Gooniyandi, and Bunaba. This is a culturally responsive approach, but they also had cultural authority to speak on behalf of the people from their language group. The ACOs are the delivery arm, not the decision-making arm. Now, that does change in other places, and I'll talk about that shortly. But another example from the Kimberley would be the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre, whose board is made up of cultural bosses, those who might have a cultural role in their communities or do have a cultural role in their communities. If you engage with the CEO of CALAC, they may be able to speak on behalf of the bosses. However, that approach is generally culturally irresponsible. Of greater significance is the need to understand the broader issues relating to relationships between men and women. If I want to meet the CALAC board, I should first meet with the women, as that is culturally responsive and appropriate. And depending on those discussions, I may then be also able to meet with the men. But to just demand to meet the board would show immense disrespect to the cultural protocols. In child protection, when I was in WA as the Executive Director in Child Protection, I one day had a staff member ring me, really quite concerned, from a remote area, very upset, and it was hard to sort of get to the the bottom of what was going on. But we were having a family meeting around safety for a child, and they had decided, those leading the meeting, that the children would come into care because the men in the family would not engage in the safety meeting. What they failed to understand was that it is culturally not possible for sons-in-law to be in the same room as their mothers-in-law, to have eye contact with them or speak to them. And based on a total lack of understanding of the cultural protocols, we're going to remove children. So we had to intervene. Community leaders are often not those with cultural authority. An older person is not necessarily an elder. My aunts remind me that while they're still here, I'm not an elder. Until they then say, listen here, step up, do something. Josephine's nodding, we all get that. So it is critically important for regulators and funders as regulators to understand the cultural context at the local level. There's significant opportunities to engage in culturally responsive regulation. Understanding the local context not only improves understanding of the environment in which those whom you regulate are operating, but it demonstrates respect and a willingness to engage in different conversations. Being able to blend a Western regulation and governance approach with cultural protocols, governance and approaches is more inclusive. It's also more often deeply understood by those in community when they can align a Western concept to their cultural understanding concept. Being able to respect the immense differences in the Aboriginal community-controlled organisation landscape is also an opportunity. The genesis of these organisations is different across jurisdictions and across regions within jurisdictions. Understanding that genesis is crucial to being able to develop a regulatory approach that is consistent with the intent and purpose of the organisation. As an example, in some places, ACOs are predominantly Aboriginal medical services or native title prescribed bodies, corporate and representative bodies. In others, they are grassroots Aboriginal cooperative organisations started by family or language groups many years ago before there was funding, and they have a broad-based membership across their community. Many organisations have a broad-based membership and board representation, and some have a defined group of membership that is a family group, particularly in a native title context. And therefore, those organisations have a different cultural approach to their governance. Some have a Western style of governance with a cultural approach to service delivery. Some have a cultural approach to governance and a Western style of delivery. Regulation isn't just about ensuring that the funds are being spent properly, that the organisation is operating within the legislation, or that they're delivering funded services. It is about supporting the non-government sector, and often the government sector, to become the strong, reliable service providers that we need them to be. In the case of regulation, for example, the justice system, there's a need to understand that it's not just about following the rules of incarceration, ensuring staff are trained, but it is about what is the staffing model, what is the model of care, what is the approach to supporting rehabilitative approaches of those who are incarcerated, and ensuring they are delivered in culturally responsive ways. If we just focus on somebody broke the law and we've locked them up, we've missed the point of regulation. I think that's it for me, David, and happy for others to now take their turn.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. That was fantastic. Really useful insights, and I really enjoyed listening to that. Jacqueline's remarks just now, please add them onto the Q&A section of the webinar, and we'll get to those following our other speakers. I'm very pleased that Richard Weston has been able to join us today. Richard is the first Deputy Children's Guardian for Aboriginal children and young people in New South Wales at the New South Wales Government Office of the Children's Guardian. Previously, he was the Chief Executive Officer for SNAICC, which is the National for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children, and the co-chair for Family Matters. As a descendant of the Meriam people of the Torres Strait, Richard has worked in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs for more than 20 years. For 9 years, he held the position of CEO of the Healing Foundation, leading the strategic development of the organisation. And previously, Richard led the Indigenous controlled health services in Far West, New South Wales and Queensland. Richard, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, look, thanks, David, for that introduction, but the introduction to this session. Yeah, I'm a Meriam man. My people hail from the Torres Strait. I currently live on Wiradjuri country in the Riverina part of New South Wales, so I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. I've been made to feel very welcome in this part of the country, and I've worked all over Australia. I've primarily come out of a background of working in Aboriginal affairs, community-controlled organisations, and I've been doing that for the last before I came into this role, for nearly 30 years. So this is the first time I've been in a government role for a very long time, and it's been a really interesting and challenging journey so far, the last 19 months that I've been in the role. But I find myself as a Deputy Children's Guardian, and I'm working in the Office of the Children's Guardian in New South Wales. I was actually born on Gadigal country, but I did all my education and growing up on Wajak Noongar Budja, David. So I grew up in suburban Perth. But I have spent time in the Pilbara, Far West New South Wales on Barkindji country. I have familial relationships with Barkindji people and the Namal people of the Pilbara. So, yeah, I've been all over this country, and it's been, I've had that great opportunity to work with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in organisations. But in terms of being a regulator in New South Wales, these are the functions. This slide shows all of the functions, roles and functions of the Office of the Children's Guardian. And they really cover three main areas of work. So regulation in the work of our compliance, accreditation and monitoring teams, oversight in the work of the reportable conduct team, and safety in the work of our child safe team and the work of the Working with Children's Check and the NDIS Workers Check. So that covers off the functions of the Office of the Children's Guardian. So we have a big role to play in overseeing the child protection and out-of-home care systems in New South Wales. We've been through a period of fairly significant change over the last few years. Taking on the reportable conduct scheme, for example, from the New South Wales Ombudsman, that came across in 2019, I think, or 2020. We have the NDIS Workers Check, and we launched the Child Safe Scheme in New South Wales in February of this year. So there's a lot going on in New South Wales in terms of regulation and oversight of the child protection system. And my role really, I oversee two of our teams. I oversee the out-of-home care monitoring and regulation and the child safe team. So, they're teams that have a big impact on Aboriginal children and young people in out-of-home care. And I find that a really, really good place for me to sit in terms of my role. Our office has done a lot of work in the last few years in building its cultural competency. Everybody goes through, cultural competency training. We're building our Aboriginal staffing. We've been working actively on that, building the numbers of Aboriginal people working in our organisation. I guess my role primarily coming on was to build relationships with the Aboriginal community. I've been a little bit limited in that way because of COVID, but I have had the opportunity to get out and about in different parts of New South Wales and begin discussions about my role and particularly about how we deal with the major challenge in out-of-home care. For Aboriginal people, it's this high overrepresentation of our kids in the system. In New South Wales, we have more than 6,500 Aboriginal kids in out-of-home care, which represents more than 40% of all children in out-of-home care in New South Wales. And you'll find as you go across the country in different jurisdictions, those high numbers are there as well. So that's our major challenge, I think, in relation to the child protection system. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in engaging with the Aboriginal community on this challenge is because I think they have to lean into the problem. Jack was talking about, cultural authority, community leadership, cultural leadership. They're really important elements that exist in our communities and I think are going to be really important to reducing the numbers of kids coming into care and preventing children from coming into care in the first place. In our role at the ACG, we mostly deal with organisations that are caring for children once they come into the system. So we have an important role to ensure that kids maintain connection to culture, that there are good cultural plans in place. And we do that through our monitoring and accreditation work. But we are an organisation that has come on a journey over the last few years and still has a little ways to go. But we have good relationships with Aboriginal out-of-home care providers. And when you talk about closing the gap, one of the priority reforms is to build up the ACO sectors or the Aboriginal out-of-home care sector, and that's something that's actively being undertaken in New South Wales. And we have a role to play there to support that process to ensure that new Aboriginal agencies that come into the system, because we do need new ones. We have about 20 at the moment, but we're going to need more to pick up the numbers of kids in out-of-home care. But we have a role in ensuring and supporting those organisations to develop their capability to achieve accreditation. And I think that's one of the really important things that our agency does, is that we have taken a capacity building or a capability building approach to regulation. It's not just being punitive. It's taking a more of an engagement approach to support and educate agencies and individuals and communities about where they may need to improve in certain areas. And we do a lot of education and provide resources for agencies and community members to better understand that system, the work that we do. I think I'll leave it there, David, but thank you for the introduction. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. That was brilliant. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Josephine Bourne. Josephine is an academic in political science at the University of Queensland. Her research draws on expert knowledge and understanding of Indigenous politics, Australian policy and political institutions from both a practice and theoretical perspective. She's worked on various state and federal government policy initiatives, including education and leadership development, possibilities for the design of Indigenous representative mechanisms, constitutional reform options and treaty making. Her main research interest is in analysing public, private and third sector responses to complex problems and the ways the mental frames of various actors can be transformed to adopt new ways of working, with a focus on leadership, Indigenous organisational development and governance. Josephine is also the co-author of the second edition of Australian Politics in the 21st Century, Old Institutions, New Challenges. For some members of NRCoP and ANZOG, you may have noticed Josephine's recent article which was circulated in our e-newsletter. I'm hoping one of our fantastic staff from NRCoP can put the link up onto the chat. The article's excellent. I would commend it to you. Josephine said in that article that cultural barriers can include a mismatch between the perception of legitimate decision-making processes and different understandings of what constitutes a legitimate decision in the Indigenous cultural context versus what is required through regulatory guidelines. The work of understanding what is good governance in each other's worlds has not been done on any significant scale in Australia, but would go a long way to assisting with the survival of Indigenous organisations in various settings. So I commend that article to everyone. It's a great read, and I'd like to welcome Josephine to speak to you today.
Thank you, David. I guess I should, and thank you, Jacqueline and Richard, for your insights there. I should just tell people as well a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in Townsville, in North Queensland, on the lands of the Walgarukaba and Bindal people. Their fight and struggle has certainly informed my political worldview as well. I identify as a mainland Torres Strait Islander. I'm a first-generation mainland Torres Strait Islander. My ancestral heritage is through my father's line to Gumulgal, the Gumulgal peoples of Mabiog Island in the Torres Strait, and on my mother's line, my mother's ancestry is to Murray Island. That's a connection with Richard there, and Dawar Island, which is one of the Murray Islands, as well as Badu Island, which is in the Western Torres Strait. And look, all of those threads have, informed my political worldview and the way I try to understand our situation as First Nations people here in Australia. And I'm very grateful for the opportunities I've had as well to travel around the country and to listen to other First Nations people talk about their origin stories when it comes to, and Jacqueline, you touched on this, about the different kind of organisational mechanisms our people have engaged with. So I've just been so grateful to travel around the country and learn how our people have been doing this work. And today I'm joining you from Brisbane. I'm in my office at UQ on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people, and it's just beautiful country here. So I just left Townsville in February and now living in Brisbane more permanently, and it's just beautiful country. And as always, Jacqueline, as you mentioned, we always acknowledge the ancestral guardians of this place as well as the people that are here now continuing that custodianship so that we can be here as well and be safe in what we're doing and be informed. Our work can be informed by the spirit of this place as well. So yeah, I feel very grateful to be online with all of you. And so I think, David, the commitment that you talked about for the government to be building their capability is something that's really important as well, because in terms of the work that Richard is doing and Jacqueline and so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisation leaders across the country, we've always been, there's always this focus on Indigenous people building their capacity, but there's never this talk about governments developing their capabilities to engage with us. And Jacqueline's shared examples, some concrete examples there of where things didn't go quite right in that initial engagement. And look, things haven't been going right always around policy development as well, in terms of our engagement, our voice kind of influencing, but also accounting for the sheer diversity that can, sometimes be described as complex and complicated, but certainly not insurmountable. And I think, you know, when I listen to people now talk about how we're doing this work, even the work that Jacqueline and Rich has already talked about, that gives me a lot of hope that we can, David, as you said, back in the day, it was in the too hard basket. So we've moved on from the too hard basket, and we've already got a lot of people out there, Indigenous organisation leaders as well as non-Indigenous people, that are learning along with us as well, to kind of get to this place where we can embrace the diversity in First Nations people here in Australia, which is different from like, you know, our Indigenous brothers and sisters in New Zealand, in terms of you know, them having one language and many different dialects. But then, to what Jacqueline was saying, the sheer diversity across the mainland of Australia, and then there's even diversity just within the Torres Strait that has to be accounted for. You're not going to get the same kind of protocols and engagement in one region of the Torres Strait to another region, and you have to be, you know, open and willing, and this has to be a normal part of bureaucratic culture. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of work ahead, but I'm excited that we're having these dialogues, and I think there is a need to create more spaces for us to have these kinds of dialogues and demonstrate and start to do that act of respecting that we have different systems. And I think, you know, even the negotiations, Jacqueline, I really like that you were talking about the different ways that our people interact, whether sometimes they have the cultural element sitting in the governing decision-making, and they might have the Western way of delivery, you know, those kind of different combinations of how our people are engaging or interfacing with state mechanisms. Like all of that, us even talking about it, and to everybody online and understanding these are the nuances. So I think creating more of these kind of spaces for us to talk, so it's just a known thing. And so it's then coming into our way of being and the way we actually operate. I think this is the beginning, and I feel excited because we've got the Queensland government who's just last week announced a further commitment to a treaty, looking at a treaty process. We've got the Victorian government and the mob down there that's a bit further along. And I think for me, when we were going through the process with the Queensland Treaty, we were looking at British Columbia in Canada as a case. And, you know, over there in 2019, they've just amended their Child, Family and Community Service Act, and it came into force. And that's an act that actually supports governments to make agreements with communities and work in a way more collaborative way to do planning around you know, services for children, youth and families. And especially from a Queensland perspective, just thinking about Richard there having a slightly different setup in New South Wales, you know, there's not enough involvement of our families and our people, and especially accounting for the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait people are vulnerable people. And I agree with you, Jacqueline, they are vulnerable to the system, and a lot of industrial complexes in the system, like you know, they're just sitting ducks. But how do we make the system work so that, you know, children are not removed, or children are with who they should be with, despite the kind of things that people have gone through, whether that's, you know, criminal records and things like that for things that happened a long time ago, or again, criminal records that are a byproduct or an outcome of the fact that they are vulnerable in the state system. So these are the kind of things that we need to overcome and have a more collaborative approach, and just be working with First Nations people. I mean, you know, Channel 7 did something a couple of years ago where they had a panel of all non-Indigenous people talking about children being taken away, right? And so it's that kind of stuff. You know, it's really about First Nations people being able to take care of their business with and have a collaborative relationship with the state. You know, it's got to be, anyway, I hope that we're moving away from this culture where it's a bunch of people that don't know what they're talking about being allowed, getting their voices amplified. So, look, I think all the commitment that's being made, by various governments and various entities around the country to want to know more about how to better work with Indigenous people, especially in this environment of a push towards a voice and a push for treaty with all its limitations on both options. There's many limitations, but, you know, just for us to create spaces to look for what are the opportunities though? What are the opportunities that these options bring, treaty and constitutional reform for a voice, to support this, at the end of the day, Indigenous people being able to take care of their business and having the state work with us in a way where they actually see us and they actually hear us. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say. I could really just go on all day, but I think I'll just leave it there. And I'm keen to hear what questions people have. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Josephine. Yes, we do have questions. Gillian said, thank you, Jacqueline. Your insights and knowledge are badly needed. She was keen to get a copy of your talking points, Jacqueline, but I should have said right at the start that we are recording this session and we will make it public and post it up on the NZOG NRCoP YouTube channel. And as a participant, you'll get a link sent out, or if you're subscribed to our newsletter or the e-news on Indigenous issues as well, you'll receive a copy of this presentation. So the questions are coming in from our audience, so please send them in now if you have them. There was a question whether there is a framework that existed which underpins this cultural responsiveness. I'm not sure, Josephine, whether you could answer that. Is there one place to go in terms of a framework nationally around cultural responsiveness, or is it really the national agreement which is trying to drive this at all levels of government, for each level of government and each agency to work its way through what the part that it needs to play in closing the gap?
Well, okay, I'll answer part of this. I'm sure Jacqueline and Richard might have something to say as well. But at the moment, my understanding is different institutions or organisations are making a commitment to creating various frameworks. I'm in the higher ed sector now, so definitely in higher education, we have leadership of Indigenous pro-vice chancellors across the country driving that work, which is fantastic. And that role of the Indigenous pro-vice chancellor is fairly new as well. So the higher ed sector, from like you was explaining, from the top, but still working with people within the institutions and then also extending to communities, have worked to build that leadership capability within the sector of higher ed to start creating those frameworks. So that's an example there. But yeah, I don't know that there's one that you can just point to. Jacqueline? Yeah.
So it's still in education. So when I was in the Department of Education in WA, we developed an Aboriginal cultural standards framework for culturally responsive schools. And what we found is you need to align it to something that means something. So if you want teachers to do something, you need to align it to the AITSL standards for teaching and learning. And if you want to do a cultural standards framework or a culturally responsive approach, it has to be about your local area and it has to be something you do in partnership. It also has to be something where you're accountable. So when we developed the culturally responsive schools framework in WA, it was based on a continuum, which is something that staff understand in teaching. Everything's on a continuum. And it started with, here's what it means to be culturally aware. Like, you know, us blackfellas exist. But we've been talking cultural awareness for 50 or more years. So if you haven't got past the fact, you know, we exist, then there's an issue. But it goes across 4 levels through to culturally responsive. And that's at culturally responsive, it's about, you've got Aboriginal people involved in the leadership of the school from the community in which the school is located, that you are engaging them in decision making. They're not just an advisory group that has a meeting with the principal once a year. But then also those schools had to report once a year on what activities they had undertaken against the 5 different areas. So there was leadership, there was teaching and learning, there was a number of areas, and how they were moving across that continuum towards culturally responsive approaches. So there's not one size fits all because each of the environments are different. One of the things that everyone's talked about is out-of-home care. In WA, 57% of children and young people in out-of-home care are Aboriginal. 57%. That has increased 10% in 10 years. When I was in child protection here, it was 47%. There's a whole range of things around culturally responsive approaches that come into play in a child protection sense. For example, I often talk about your cultural lens, and that's not a black-white cultural lens. That's about if you grew up, you know, in a 4x2 house in a relatively nice suburb, and each kid had their own bedroom, and you know, you all played sport, and mum and dad both worked, or dad worked and mum was at home. That's your cultural lens of the world. And then you become a child protection worker, and you come to my family when I was a kid, and there's multiple children in the house, and you've only got a 3-bedroom state govy house, and your father's incarcerated, and your mother's working 2 jobs or isn't able to get a job. You determine that that is neglect. It is not, it is poverty. So cultural responsiveness in a child protection sense is different to an education sense. The other thing that is really frustrating for me is, as an example, Aboriginal family-led decision-making in child protection has been going for quite a number of years in some jurisdictions, particularly in Victoria. So WA has decided to do Aboriginal family-led decision-making, but it's a trial. It's a pilot. I am yet to see Mission Australia, Wansley, Salvation Army, all of the big NGOs be asked to do a pilot or a trial. But the minute we do something in the Aboriginal space, even when it's proven to work for our cultural context, we make it a pilot or a trial. That's just culturally irresponsible. So there is a need for you to understand the local context. There is a need to understand what is the stream of work that you are regulating. And there is a need then to start to have those conversations with the community about what does culturally responsive look like in that context.
Thanks, Jacqueline. There's a question here which is getting a lot of upvotes on the Q&A function. It's from Fran. Hi, I'm interested in how a government agency can respectfully engage with and include First Nations people when we have no staff who identify as First Nations people. And I think that probably relates to another question which came through about common themes or issues directly. This is a question for you, Richard. What are some of the common themes or issues you have come across when implementing capacity building initiatives? But could I maybe ask you, Richard, just to comment on that question from Fran about how does an agency go about this if they don't have First Nations staff?
Yeah, we'll get some. Look, I think one of the things that's made a difference for our agency in New South Wales, there's been a number of factors that have influenced our organisation in its change. And I talked a bit earlier about the changes that we've been through, but one of them is our leadership of our children's guardian, Janet Scorer. I mean, she's been implementing a 3-year strategic plan that's done all this stuff. So we need really good non-Indigenous leadership that understands the ideas that Josephine and Jack have been talking about that Aboriginal people have their own philosophies and they have their own capabilities and they have their own leadership structures and methods. It's not about leading in a way where you do it for us or do it for Aboriginal people. It's about being able to create the space for Aboriginal leaders and informants to come in and support and advise the work that you do and help you change the work you do. We've done some work on our Working with Children's check, which is something that Josephine was talking about, and in how we created the organisation. This happened before I came on board, but they created a First Nations policy which really talked about, the historical impacts of colonisation, particularly removal of children, the historical removal of children, the impact of trauma, the history of why people have historical criminal records, that go back a long way, and that has a big impact on people who are trying to become carers or work with children. They have to have they have to get a working with children's clearance. But we have a process that helps helps our workforce engage more effectively with the Aboriginal community, and so they can have a conversation about what's on their record, and that they can put the Aboriginal applicants can put their story forward. So we're not just relying on the police record or the employment record alone. There are certain things in people's history that we have no discretion over, but often, what's going on in our communities in its engagement with the system, there's a lot of suspicion and fear. And people are fearful, women are fearful of reporting things like domestic violence, because we see it quite often that children end up being removed in those situations. So there's lots of distrust and fear, and we have to try and overcome that. So our agencies has taken steps to understand better the history, and when it's performing that regulatory role around working with children's checks, trying to be more sensitive to where people are at. And it helps. We need more carers. We need more Aboriginal people working with our kids. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Richard. There is a question I might direct to Josephine, a question about where we can find Australian case studies regarding cultural governance and the Western model of delivery, or Western governance and cultural delivery. That's probably an academic question, Josephine, if you know about some resources.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's there's more there now than when I first started out being very interested in this. There is the Australian Institute of Indigenous Governance, which was set up just not so long ago, but they have some great tools on their website. I don't know. There's just so many. But look, there's the work that's come out of ANU as well, through the Centre for Aboriginal Economic CAPER and Participation Research there. There's so many. But I'll point you first to the Australian Institute of Indigenous Governance, and also try Reconciliation Australia. But I think a lot of that information has gone over to the AIGI. But there are examples out there. Jacqueline, do you know of any other places that people, and Richard, sorry, with cultural governance?
IATS is also the
of
Australian
course.
Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. CEO there, Craig. There's been a lot of work done. Just about every university has done some work on this. So if you're in WA, ECU and Curtin and UWA, if you're in Melbourne, obviously Monash, University of Melbourne, Deakin, New South Wales, there's a lot of work being done in Wollongong, University of New South Wales in Wollongong, and in the different contexts. So what it looks like in health, what it looks like in child protection, what it looks like in education. So there's plenty of examples out there.
Yeah, and I think, David, I did put some links on that editorial, pointing people to various things. There's, especially for those very interested in the conceptual understandings of Aboriginal political concepts, the work from Dr. Mary Graham and my colleague here, Associate Professor Morgan Brigg, and they did an ABC Radio National series. So that's a really great series to have a listen to as well.
Can I speak? Yes, sorry. I don't know if you're hearing me. Look, I'd just add there are working models in Australia at the moment beyond and going beyond the treaty stuff that's going on in Victoria and Queensland. There's in New South Wales, there's the Murti-Parky Regional Assembly, which has been going for 18 years, unincorporated, 16 communities coming together to assemble, driving their own change, improving relationships amongst themselves and with government. They've been able to negotiate over the last 18 years a number of regional partnership agreements with both Commonwealth and state. There's a DILAC that operates in the NT. There's the TSRA, the regional authority. So there's these models that are working. Some of them are more formal, like the TSRA, and there are others that are more, I suppose. Well, I worked in the Murti-Parky region, so I really loved that model because it was community just really not seeking permission to do what they did, to organise themselves and just going to do it. And they've never incorporated into a body because they always felt that government could never get rid of them if they weren't incorporated. So there has been a movement, for quite a number of years, and I think, closing the gap agreement, very significant, but the new government talking about constitutional recognition, treaty making and truth telling, I think quite exciting developments.
Thanks, Richard. Jacqueline, a question. One of our listeners said it was great to listen to your insights. Could you provide us with a starting point on how to go about determining who would be the most appropriate community representatives to consult with? This can often be difficult to understand where to start. So where should somebody start if they're not sure where to go?
You should ask our people. So in different places, there are different organisations that you could start with. So, in New South Wales, local Aboriginal land councils can give you a head start. There are also peak bodies. If you're working in health, you might want to go to NRCoP or the state peaks, AQUA, AXA, AMSANT in the Northern Territory, Quake in Queensland, Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council in New South Wales. So there are a number of organisations you can go to as a starting point. Not recently, it was quite some years ago now, somebody said to me, I just don't know how do we go about talking to Aboriginal people. And I said, well, you open your mouth and you use your voice box, right? I mean, we're not this foreign concept, but it is about, our people are very open and willing to share and willing to engage if we're shown respect. So, when I go to a new Aboriginal country and community and language group, and as you said, I've worked in all jurisdictions, and that includes Tasmania. I've worked there, I just haven't lived there. I often say to our own mob, I want to ask some questions. Some of them might be not culturally right for me to ask because I don't know all the protocols here, and I really apologise if I do that. And they say, it's all right, we'll let you know. Right. So it's about not being afraid to ask questions, but saying up front that you might not know everything and you don't want to be culturally inappropriate, but you recognise it because you don't know something. Just being honest about not knowing what your starting point is really critically important. And then saying to people, who's the best people to speak to? We want to talk about this issue or these sets of regulatory requirements in this industry. Who do we best speak to? I note someone said about Victoria and community education. Victoria has a range of governance committees. Now, it's an unusual structure, but in Victoria, the Marung Central Governing Council for Education has a number of representatives on there. Now, many of those representatives are also on other forums, the Youth Justice and other forums. But one of the challenges is that that's often just the metro organisation CEOs who themselves are Aboriginal. If you're talking about education, each of the local areas in Victoria also has Aboriginal education councils. In Victoria, there is the Victorian Aboriginal Education Association Incorporated, VAI. I think Auntie Geraldine is still the chair and Lionel is still the CEO. And they're a great place to start. So it's about looking around what are the peak organisations that might be able to direct you to what are the local organisations, and then in those getting an understanding of who the language groups are. And if you're going to Bendigo, as an example, you really want to speak to Raylene at Bendigo and District Aboriginal Co-op, but you also want to speak to Jar Jar Rung, because that is the cultural authority group.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. We are getting towards the end of our time for the webinar. Could I maybe ask the three of you just to maybe provide one or two things or tips you think we should take next as community of practice covering government regulators at all levels of government? What do you think we could do next to take this issue forward and to have the most impact? What would you like to see the regulatory community doing more of or stop doing in the future? And maybe some of your tips on what you'd like this community practice to do, where we're trying to learn from each other and learn from yourselves about how to improve both the outcomes that we've been trying to achieve in our various fields, but also the way in which we do it in a way which would be much more culturally responsive. I might start with you, Richard.
Thanks, David. Look, I think you've obviously already started that document you held up, Shane's document at the start. I thought that was great when I saw it, that, you know, that a group of senior public service leaders yeah, that's the one. I've got a copy right here too, but I think, so congratulations to Shane and the other people he worked with to pull that together. But, you know, that's a really conscious kind of thinking and reflection about, well, what's going on at the moment in Aboriginal affairs. And the changes are huge, you know. I think we saw a ripple went around the world in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered in America. I mean, that sent something, a wave of something or other that went around the world. But I think in Australia, we've been, you know, we have the Closing the Gap agreement, which is a significant agreement. And the way that we arrived at that is quite a feat. And congratulations, I always praise Pat Turner for getting us that agreement. But it's got everybody's agreed to it, you know, all governments, including the local government association. So I think it's pleasing that, you know, government leaders, public servants are thinking about what's the impacts, what's the implications. So I'd encourage you to keep doing that. I'd be thinking about, what does constitutional recognition mean? What does a national voice to Parliament supported by local and regional voices mean to the way we're going to be doing business with Aboriginal communities going forward? What are the impacts of truth telling going to be? And then treaties, you know, if you follow the Victorian example, and it's always good the Vics like to go first on things because it's very complex and complicated, and so we can learn from them. But you know, some really great opportunities for our nation. You know, what role do we want to play in this changing, resetting a relationship with the first peoples? And so I think I'll go back to the point I made earlier about the need for non-Indigenous leadership to play a big role as well and support Aboriginal leadership. I think some of the questions asked about, you know, how do you engage with Aboriginal people? Well, you know, our people are diverse. And sometimes when you go and you may have an issue that you're quite passionate about, but it may not be a priority for the community that you're seeking to engage. So you do have to, you know, find those ways into those conversations. Use your Aboriginal staff. I think they're underutilised in many ways. I see that in New South Wales anyway. They have great cultural connections to communities and all of that. Make use of them, and then go with a good heart. You know, go with an open heart and look. And I've seen it. I've been all over the country working. Aboriginal people, it's got nothing to do with money or anything. You know, what we're trying to do is achieve what is our just right. You know, this is our nation. You know, we have a right to our history. We have a right to our culture. We have a right to our connection to country. And that's really what we're fighting for, that we will be here for another 60,000 years, and that our children will get to enjoy, you know, what a great place Australia is. And that's what I really liked about your introduction, David. You talked about nature, you talked about black cockatoos. I mean, that was inspiring. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. There were some amazing closing remarks. We've got such good feedback on the chat function from everyone who's been listening. Jacqueline, could I ask you maybe to provide some closing remarks or suggestions or tips on what we should be doing more at all levels of government when we have regulatory responsibilities impacting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
I think the first thing is to change from a deficit approach. What is most commonly seen in our organisations is that regulators come with a view that we're not doing it well, or we can't do it properly, or so we have to change our thinking. We are very capable people. You know, a colleague in Queensland said last week, when someone said, oh, 1 in 5 Aboriginal children are in out-of-home care. Well, that means 4 out of 5 are thriving at home. So we have to change the narrative from a deficit approach and work collaboratively with those we regulate to get the right outcomes. Keep these discussions going. Understand the challenges and the concerns and discuss the barriers with a solutions focus. Work out what is a must and what is a nice, and, you know, what is urgent and important. And urgent and important, I believe, in a regulatory sense, is exactly what Richard was talking about. It is about recognising the strengths in our communities. It is about recognising that we need to do this in partnership, whether you're in child protection, whether you're regulating the gaming industry, whether you're regulating anything. It is about understanding who are the partners in this, and the partners are those you're regulating, and doing this in partnership rather than an oversight, punitive approach to what we do, but how do we work in partnership for better outcomes?
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. Josephine, you're going to get the final word. I loved your closing statement in the article which we posted. Emergence of a new narrative is necessary at this point. A better way of working together, grounded in mutual respect for each other's governance knowledge and systems. Growing an appreciation for understanding the systems of governance that mean good governance in both worlds, and the possibility of redesign in the space between our worlds. I thought that was fantastic, Josephine. Would love to hear your closing remarks, and I'm assuming you might. All 3 of our speakers will be getting lots of LinkedIn requests from our people online, and follow-up questions and emails, and maybe more speaking requests in the future as well, Jacqueline and Richard and Josephine. Josephine, what would your closing remarks be to our listeners?
Well, I mean, I think on a kind of very human level, to come to this work, you know, with an open heart. I mean, I'm assuming that you will do that. But I think, you know, to keep yourself in check, because when you start to shut down and start to feel this is too hard, or this is looking so bad, this is all bad, or this would take, you know, years of lobbying and policy reform before we could change the culture here, just try to pull back and then come back at it with the right heart, because those things are happening anyway. Indigenous people are always seeing where things in the policies are not, they don't fit our worlds. And so that work's happening. There are people that are always doing that work, and all of us are informing that work in some way. So I think the change is happening right now. You know, everything's very exciting with this new government, see how far they can take things. And of course, a commitment to personal leadership. And I think something that Jacqueline mentioned, and I actually spoke to my postgrad students about this morning as well. Well, they talked about it and we all talked about it, was just being comfortable with not knowing. That And that's where you yourself make yourself vulnerable to the learning from others. And I mean, we often in Indigenous context, humility and being humble is very important. And because when you approach Indigenous people, you know, you could be saying one thing, but your hands or your actions are doing another thing. So that in itself is going to show whether, or is going to be a mark of whether there's going to be this genuine relationship that starts. So yeah, I think just be mindful of bringing your heart to the work. I think I'll end it with that, yeah.
That's a great way to finish, Josephine. Jacqueline, Richard, Josephine, thanks for your time. Some great feedback on the chat for the wise words, knowledge, and guidance. Everyone will be able to access this and share this conversation when we post the recording on the NRCoP YouTube channel. Everyone will also receive a feedback survey, which will be sent out later this afternoon. So please fill in that survey, provide us some input on what you'd like to see more of from NRCoP and the National Regulators Community of Practice. Our next seminar is going to be a hybrid online and in-person event in Sydney. That's on the 21st of September. It'll be 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And our topic is building frontline capability in complaints handling. That'll be followed by a lunchtime networking session for those who are able to make it in New South Wales. Thanks very much for joining us today. I've learned a lot. I've really appreciated the advice and the time and the guidance provided by our speakers. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.